I want you to get some of your sewing stuff together. You start sewing, get a cup of coffee, and I'm going to base this quilt, and we can just visit while we quilt. So I will tell you that this is a quilt pattern. It's getting stuck. Pattern that a friend of mine, Colleen Murdy, she designed this pattern, and it's one that I took a class. You can see a little bit what it is. Took a class. It's different than the things that I normally do, so this was a challenge for me. And because of that, this one's going to be a little bit of a challenge for me to baste, only because it's a little bit bubbly here and there. I've done my best to be as accurate as I can, and I know that when I quilt, a lot of the things that I think just look kind of amateur will look much better once I start quilting. So I'm using my quilt tack gun as always, and I'm going to tack as we go. Now this particular quilt was done with Kona cotton, and sometimes the Kona cottons are a little bit, they're more tightly woven. They're really nice fabric. This white is a Kona. But what they are is they're tightly woven. So this, well, I would love to do this one by hand because I think it would really lend itself to some cool hand quilting. I'm probably not going to, because the Kona means that it's going to be a little bit tougher. Now, in my younger days, I would have done it, but now that I have a little bit of problems with my thumbs, it's probably better that I give myself a break and use easy fabrics to needle through when I'm doing hand quilting. Okay, so as always, here's one that's got a little bubble. I am going to then be flattening as I go. So I have a question for you, and leave me some comments down below because I love to hear what you have to say. My question to you is, what was the first quilt that you ever made? Do you remember it? How long ago was it? What was it? So for me, and I'll answer the question too, the first quilt I made was when I was 14, and I know that, maybe 15. I know that because I embroidered my age. When I signed the quilt, I embroidered my name and my age. I don't do that anymore because now I do a date. If you want to figure, if ancestors want to figure out how old I was, they can do that. But I did sign it. Something that I'm not that good at now. I need to get better at signing the quilts that I make. I haven't done it till now just because a lot of as a younger quilter, I was making quilts for my own family, you know, for myself and the kids. And so it didn't seem like I needed to sign them, but I know I should. But boy, when I'm done, I'm done. So I've been working on that. But my mother taught me to quilt when I was very young. When she figured we were old enough, I had two sisters. When she figured we were old enough to use the sewing machine without hurting ourselves, when she walked away, then she taught us how to quilt. And she had just learned not too long before. She was a young mom. She is a young mom. And so she was a good teacher because it had been very recently that she had learned. Now, she did a lot of clothes sewing. So that, of course, if you start with clothing construction, quilting is a really obvious, a really easy change to make. Every once in a while, I'm smoothing out the bottom. Bottom feels great. Okay. Because I have some bubblies, because like I said, I'm not an expert quilter. I love to quilt, but my family does not expect them to be perfect, nor will they be, even if they expect that. I'm going to put tacks a little closer here so that I can really, it helps me quilt and make sure that I'm able to work in any extra fabric that might be on top where the blocks didn't exactly size up correctly. I did my best. I really did. This was a big challenge for me. But my first quilt was squares. So my mom said, cut a bunch of squares, and she gave us a cereal box, and she said, trace a square. We always traced, so we probably found something that was square and traced it. But we didn't use a lot of rulers back then, so we probably found something. I always know that when she wanted to make a circle, it was easy to find things that were circular that we could trace. Glasses, ashtrays back then, anything that was different, paper towel rolls, or however we did it. We drew a perfect square, and I think mine were probably 4-inch squares, and then I sewed them together in long strips. So we kind of didn't know, I didn't know ahead of time what the next step would be. And that was probably because why overwhelm us with all the steps when today we're probably just going to do one step. So she started us with sewing strips. And so we did that for a while, and we were basically collecting our strips of squares. These were all fabrics from Mom's scrap basket, which I loved. Actually, it was a box, cardboard box. And when we got enough of the strips, she said, now you're going to sew them together length to length. Now, she is just teaching us. And so one thing my mom is great at is that when she's teaching us something, she was all right to let us go and kind of do it our way. I also think it was because we were home for the summer from school, and she had a whole lot of things she was trying to do at once. So she said, sew these together. So I did. And she was off to do all the other things she's working on for the day, to lunch and laundry and everything else. And then what I didn't understand was that you should sew them together so that all the corners match. I sort of thought, if I understood that, that's not necessary. And so I sewed them, and I still think it wasn't necessary. I sewed them together, and they were in none of the corners matched where they should, and they would even be pretty far apart at certain points because maybe my cutting wasn't all that accurate. I love that quilt. I still have that quilt somewhere, and I backed it with white flannel. That's what we had. That was an inexpensive, I think. And of course, it would be soft, it would be warm. We put batting in the middle. And I think that one we tied. So she would start us out with tying quilts, and that's still a great way to start. If you're doing a quilt and you're new at it and you're just focusing on the top, tying them is a perfectly fine way to finish a quilt. She would have us tie with yarn, like acrylic yarn, because she had scraps. If I were to do that now, and if I were to teach someone now, I would say use like a pearl cotton or a crochet cotton, because then it'll be a small, delicate tie that's in the quilt. We used the acrylic yarn, which meant that after you washed it a bunch of times, you have a bunch of little nubbies of color, and that's fine. It's just a more a less sophisticated, more folk art looking type of finish. Okay, now I got some bubbles toward this end, which happens as we go, but that's why I like to smooth as I go. And one thing I always remind people, when you're using the quilt tack guns, they are wonderful. But they're also super sharp, and it never fails, and I just did it, is I have poked myself, and so now I'm bleeding. Because we have a lot of weight on this quilt, I don't want that. So I'm going to I have one of these fun Band-Aids to put on. And as you see, I keep it right next to my table where I do this. So the quilt that I finished was my favorite. It wasn't frustrating. It was, I loved it. I still love it. And I did keep it. And I'm glad that I did keep it, because what I found out from I didn't know I'd be sewing for years, or whether I'd like it or not. For us, it was just something we were doing that summer. We didn't have a lot of kids who lived near us, so we had to keep busy. Mom had to keep us busy. And she did that by teaching us how to embroider, how to quilt, how to sew a skirt, how to do a little bit of crochet. Okay, I can feel my center seam underneath where I have pieced together my backing. So I'm making sure that's flat. This gives me a nice time to make sure. I'm going to look at it because I think I'm getting a little bit of bulk. Okay, we're going to make sure that pulls. I'm taking these two out. So I'm taking a couple out because I can feel on the back. I'm taking a couple out because I can feel on the back the seam where I sewed the backing together. I was using 44-inch backing. It has bubbled just a little bit on that seam, which is easy for me to fix at this point. So it's doing well up to here. Okay. So you can see that taking these out is not hard to do. And yes, I throw them on the floor. I shouldn't, but I have I vacuum up afterwards with a broom, or I also just got a really cool new hand vac. It's one of those look like a stick. I do love that. It's just very handy, but it's just a hand vacuum, like all the other dust busters. So I kept that quilt all these years, and I do love it because it really shows progress for me, and it can show you progress in so many ways. There was a time when I've belonged to different guilds over the years. Seam, so I can, yeah, good. And so they had a program one time where it was bring in your first quilt. And it was very interesting. So what you always see is, when you think about your first quilt, if it's been a while, what you see is some older fabrics and older patterns. You know, I never knew quilting would change so much over those years. I just thought quilting would always be the same. And when I learned to quilt in the early 80s, late 70s, it was, everybody was doing the very traditional. You learned the names of the blocks, the card trick and the Ohio Star, and you did very traditional. There were probably about 20 different blocks that everybody kind of knew the names of. Churn dash, windmill, that of course have lots of different names, but Missouri Star, Texas Star is one of them. But we just had a handful that we worked with because it was during the bicentennial time, and quilting was making a revival during that time, because everybody was like going back to colonial days. We were celebrating 200 years as a nation, and so everybody, you know, was dressing up and having parades where you dressed up as, settlers, colonial people with the bonnets, kind of like the Little House on the Prairie, in the big skirts. And we did, and my mother made all three of us the dresses, colonial dresses and matching bonnets, and we wore them to several places that year. But that's why everybody was into it was making a comeback, because quilting had become kind of an old-fashioned thing at that time, and there wasn't a lot of supplies and things that were being made for a quilt industry like we have now. We've come a really long way, which has been wonderful to watch. But we now have so many different types of blocks, so many different ways to make our own blocks, so many different techniques as far as how you're quilting. Everybody pieced by machine, mostly, and then quilted by hand. Nobody yet was doing the I think we talked about this. Nobody yet, when I first started, was doing like the machine quilting. It came along soon after, but not right away. But that first quilt has old fabrics in it. I didn't know fabrics would change so much, but now I can look at fabrics and know exactly which 10-year period they're from. And I just thought, oh, it would take forever to learn those types of things. No, not really. Not really forever, and I didn't really have to learn it. It just came along as it did.
And if you like this video, please subscribe so that you will see more in the future.